Hello, I'm Katja Donovan, Executive Director of 1014, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the fifth conversation in a series of online discussions organized by the American Council on Germany and 1014 under the heading Democracies Under Pressure, Challenges for the Global Liberal Order. In recent years, we have seen internal and external challenges to democracy and waning trust in democratic institutions and practices. In today's conversation, we would like to address the question, will the liberal, rules-based world order survive this global trend of democratic backsliding? Joining us today to talk about one of the many tools of authoritarian influence to gain, increase, or consolidate power, election interference, are two true experts on democracy studies. Sarah Pagung, Associate Fellow in the International Order and Democracy Program at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and Dr. John Glenn, Senior Director of the National Endowment for Democracies, International Forum for Democratic Studies. Welcome, herzlich willkommen to the two of you. But before we get started, I would like to remind everyone that the ACG and 1014 are both independent, non-partisan organizations. So the views expressed during this conversation are those of our two guests.
Good morning from me to our viewers in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. I'd also just like to remind you that if you have a question for our speakers, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll do our best to fold your questions into the conversation. If your question is directed to a specific person, please let us know. As Katja said in her introduction, with this series, ACG and 1014 are trying to unpack some of the challenges facing democracies that make up the global liberal order. And so John and Sarah, we'd like to begin by asking each of you to describe or define what you see as democratic backsliding in some places. John, why don't we start with you and then bring Sarah into the conversation?
It sounds great. And please let me extend my thanks, Steve. It's great to be here with you, Katja as well, and with Sarah as well. This is, I think, a really timely conversation, and one that permeates a lot of our broader discussions about what's going on in the world today. So I'm really glad to have a chance to join you here. I would situate these issues, I'll grab the obvious thing that from on the table, which is the observation many make from Freedom House, that this is now the 16th year of democratic decline globally, measured by a very comprehensive report, Freedom in the World, that they've been doing for a long time. But what does that mean is really the question in my mind. And I would situate this in two things, and I'll be brief here, and then I really love to hear sort of more of Sarah's thoughts. But the two relevant pieces are sort of from what? And I think for many people, the sense of decline has to do with, since there was in 1989, a sense of democratic blooming. This at the time was talked about the third wave of democratization, the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Warsaw Pact, but not only there, in many other parts of the world, this perception that certainly those of us working on these issues in the 1990s felt that this was a moment when democracy was out there. We can even remember the ways, slightly misunderstood, that Frank Fukuyama's piece about the end of history was proposed. It was the only model. We know now, of course, that's different. The reason that I think 2005 is often taken as the kind of marker was this was a moment where, initially thought part of this wave of democratization, the so-called color revolutions in Georgia and in Ukraine. This was, of course, the Rose Revolution in Georgia and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine took place, but actually did not succeed. And the perception was that some of the authoritarian powers, Russia and China, saw these efforts as threats to them and changed their strategy. So I feel that, one, there's this piece about what happened, what's it situating. It's from 1989. 2005, broadly taken, as the beginning of this trend. But I think that I would emphasize that this really is a global matter. And I'll leave only a sense of definitions to sort of get us where we go, because otherwise it can feel like it's everything, and if it's everything, it's nothing. I would observe that democratic backsliding we really should reserve for places where we think there was meaningful democracies to backslide from. So for example, I would say there hasn't been democratic backsliding in China. or now I mean it almost, or in North Korea. So it means something different. We've seen a number of countries where there's been a kind of consolidation and a deepening of authoritarian regimes, and that can be interesting. We can think about Belarus, for example, or something along those lines. But I think by democratic backsliding, we tend to mean countries with a measure of democracy. And I will emphasize that what you include often is a motion of art. Does Egypt count for democratic backsliding? Depends in part on how you assess the liberalization and the moment that they had after the Arab Spring and what happened from then. For some, it does. For some, they say, I'm not sure that really sort of rises to that level. And then similarly, analytically, a degree and measure of backsliding and that we think has had an impact on the nature of the democratic institutions. So the mere rise of a populist party in Sweden, for example, doesn't feel like democratic backsliding, and I think in this definition. It may be interesting to observe as part of a trend of populism that may be related, but it's a different phenomenon. I would emphasize that a lot of this discussion focuses on what I might call, using Freedom House's terms, the partly free countries. So we look and we say, look at this backsliding in India, in Brazil, in the Philippines, in Poland and Hungary. But it's certainly not immune to that because, in fact, of course, the United States is often discussed as part of that backsliding. It's a global phenomenon. So if I can, maybe I'll start the conversation by observing the time phenomenon, 89, 2005. But then also sort of set the parameters with which we might have that discussion. Although, of course, I'm open to Sarah and others' thoughts about how we might consider really what the issues are. And then we can certainly talk about what's driving it after that.
Yeah, John, thank you very much for taking a step back and providing this sort of more historic perspective, if you will, and reminding us of 1989 and kind of the sense of optimism that many people had in 89 and 90. And how that has evolved and changed over the last decade or so. Sarah, listening to John talk, and he gave us sort of a real, tour d'horizon in terms of looking at around the world, both at Europe, at the former Soviet space, but then also thinking about countries like Egypt, but also India and Brazil. As you were listening to John, what struck you? What are some elements of this sort of democratic backsliding, if you will, that you think are also worth bringing to the fore?
So first, Steve and Katja, many thanks for the invitation, and John, great to be with you here today. So I would very much agree with what John just said, that we at the one hand have a feeling of democracy under siege, which doesn't have to do necessarily with democratic backsliding. But if we really focus on states that we consider or considered democracies and look what is the definition of these countries backsliding away from democracy, I think it's like maybe a basic simple definition would be that it's a state-led weakening of institutions that secure democracy. So for example, elections, but also fundamental rights. But I think it's more than that. And that's something that can be hard to pinpoint, because it's also about rules, about culture, about norms that secure and enable democracies. And the erosion of this norm is also what defines democratic backsliding, because this erosion makes it possible that certain actors exploit loopholes in the legal setup of democracy, and that enables democratic backsliding. And I think a very common variant, or a variant of concern, especially in Europe, is that we have, or that we see the creation of an overpowered executive that damages rule of law, that also subdues the legislative and the judiciary. And that is something that we can, for example, see in also different variations, but that what we can see in Poland and Hungary, for example. And for me, the main driver of this, even though or this whole story fits into the greater narrative of growing authoritarianism worldwide, it's mostly for me a domestic issue of interest groups, parties, leaders, groups around these kind of people that pursue the abolishment of checks and balances and the creation of this overpowered executive for the just for the sake of maintaining power and holding onto power. And for this, they just instrumentalize or exploit ruptures and rifts that are already present in these societies and also in our own societies. So societal or political polarization, inequality, for example, the alleged need to modernize a country economically or politically, and then they instrumentalize these things. So for me, talking about the authoritarian rise that John just mentions is just the the shell basically of democratic backsliding happening within certain European countries, but I see it also a risk, for example, for the US, but also for Great Britain.
Mm-hmm. So thank you both, because I think we're sort of unpacking a very nuanced picture here, and obviously it's hard to get at the issue of democratic backsliding in just broad brushstrokes, but really to look at different situations in different countries and in different places. And Sarah, you started talking about some of sort of the root causes behind why we're seeing some of this on a domestic level, right? I mean, you were talking about polarization in many countries at the national level. That's contributing to a waning confidence in democratic institutions and democratic practices. And I think it would be interesting to hear from each of you sort of on this domestic level, in countries that we would describe as being democracies, whether they're full-fledged or fledgling democracies. Can each of you talk a little bit more about why we're seeing this lack of trust, this lack of confidence? Where is that coming from?
I'd be happy to
jump in there. Please, John, go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to pick up that I really think is important of what Sarah said and emphasized is what she's really calling attention to is that, when we've thought about this in the past, there's been this sense of a coup d'etat. Oh, there was a democracy, but then it was overthrown. And I think that she's really pointing our attention to the way in recent years that democratically elected leaders have chosen from inside those institutions to dismantle them and weaken them. And I think that this is, while not an entirely new phenomenon, is a really important piece to understand where the drivers and where the elements are. I mean, I would say, and I will stay with your question, Steve, but I mean, I think that these discussions really do tend to have kind of an external versus an internal direction. Is this about, the force of authoritarian regimes having upon other countries, which maybe we'll talk about later when we talk about election interference. And I happen to believe it is a direct and explicit strategy of these regimes to try to do so, to undermine democracy. What's the role of technology in this and empowering it? Because I think the domestic factors, are really, if they're both very clear. The other thing, of course, that happened shortly after 2005 is the financial crisis, and this sense of globalization, perhaps not living up to, the great hopes that we may have invested in it. And this sense that is democracy failing to deliver. I think that's a clear element of a lot of this work, but the global perspective actually would suggest to us that it may be one, but not necessarily the all factor. I mean, if you look frankly at Hungary and Poland, while of course they, this issue of the crisis may have brought some of these leaders to power, their economies are doing quite well. And they have not been in economic crisis, and there has, in a sense. We can certainly talk about inequality and exclusion within countries and should, but we look at other countries in which we sort of see situations where, a real economic malaise seems to drive it. And so there's a lot of questions about how this plays, and there's been some really important research for our readers. If you didn't see, Ezra Klein recently interviewed the Harvard scholar Pippa Norris, P-I-P-P-A, and she's done some really compelling work looking at this sort of what she calls the kind of educational and cultural factors versus the economic factors, because taken by themselves, they don't always explain sort of where it comes out of. But in any case, I will end here by sort of saying that these economic factors, this discontent, this sense of inequality that has arisen in many societies, is really only an enabling factor for a leader to seize and try to use, exploit, and mobilize.
Yeah, I would support John's argument. I think when we look at whether, for example, economic inequality or triggers distrust in the political system or in democracies in particular, I think it's a question of self-efficacy. So, for example, if we have surveys, for example, in Germany, especially in Eastern Germany, about trust in the German democracy, they're often linked to answers where people say, doesn't matter if I vote or not, it won't change anything, it doesn't matter if I do something or not, it just, and I think this is something that is really important when it comes to how people, for example, in full-fledged democracies, tend to vote for parties or party leaders that exploit these legal loopholes and democratic setups and drive democratic backsliding, because these people or these groups or parties or whatever give these people a feeling of self-efficacy, and that that there's actually something changing for them. And they often do this with quite simple instruments, like increasing money, increasing welfare systems, or also welfare payments for people. That are very simple instruments that these people can use. I think this is something that that drives distrust, but also voting for potential and non-democratic leaders, or what you would maybe call semi-democratic leaders. I don't know if this is a thing, but that's maybe a good description.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And you just started already to talk about what's happening in Germany, and how Germans trust their democratic institutions, and some of the reasons why there might be waning trust in that. Both of you already mentioned Hungary and Poland, so let's take a closer look maybe at domestic politics specifically in Europe and the United States too. So just be interested, how would you describe the state of our democracies in these traditional Western, hemisphere? And do we also, coming back to the title of our talk, do we experience meddling elections in our traditional Western societies that are so deeply rooted in democracy? So John, maybe we start with you. Of course, we have this big elephant in the room, the midterm elections, and we cannot have this talk without briefly discussing that. So the results of these elections are being cast as a victory for democracy by the media. And especially since the deniers of the 2020 presidential election, who sought to become the top election officials in critical battleground states, the so-called American first slate of Secretary of State, lost at the polls. So do you see a rebound of democracy in the United States?
So on the United States, I would point out that this midterm election is really the third in elections we've held in the past every 2 years, where we've really seen a turn away from and a rejection of the sort of broad-based views of this. In 2016, Donald Trump wins to the surprise of many. But in 2018, he loses both houses of Congress. In 2020, he loses the presidency. And in 2022, despite the fundamentals of by public opinion polls, unpopular president, economic difficulties, and inflation, the traditional trends fail to materialize. I think that and so what I would suggest in many ways is that I would say in some ways, the fears about populism that many of my European colleagues have in some ways don't suggest that they've materialized. The problem for us is it's not that they've gone away. It's not. Trump won more votes in 2020 than in 2016, although he lost. And so what I think we were hoping for, some of us, was a sort of almost a repudiation of that view, which we did not get. And so I feel like we're often caught in this border of this. And if I may, I would say in the transatlantic space, this has raised a lot of questions about whether America can be trusted. You know, well, it's nice that you offer that, President X, but might another just come in and, you know, change the game? And there are real legitimate questions about the credibility of America's voice. But I think, in fact, these past 3 elections suggest that at least the worst fears have not materialized. And in the United States, I would simply say this populist, white nationalist voice has been present in our politics for a long time. What's different is it had never captured a party or entered the White House. And that was what was really different about what happened now. And so it's hard for me to think and see it solely in terms of the globalization story that I told earlier when I look at the United States.
Thank you so much, John. And speaking about populist and nationalist, Sarah, so you already mentioned Poland and Hungary exploiting loopholes, violating checks and balances. We certainly see, authoritarian tendencies and leaders in these countries. We also know in Turkey, there's presidential election coming up next year. So what's your take about what's happening in Europe?
I'm not that sure if there is a general take on Europe, because what we do see are quite different paths of development. So, for example, we have Turkey, where it's the question if it was a full-fledged democracy at all before. So that's certain different part of development. And then we have Poland and Hungary, who were in transition and doing quite successfully, I would say, and now backsliding. And we also have consolidated democracies, like, for example, Germany or France, who are also experiencing real challenges with regards to populism, and in particular right-wing populism. I think the challenges that these countries face are very different because, for example, if we look to Hungary, we do have a legal setup that cannot be considered fully democratic anymore. So in this case, it's really about maybe rebuilding or repairing the institutional setup. When we look to Germany, for example, we do have a functioning institutional setup, but what we do see is that a certain part of the population, and it's by far not the majority, it's a minority, maybe, I don't know, something from 10 to 20%, that considers itself not being really part of the democratic system, or that opposes the system that we do have in Germany. And coming back to your question that you also asked in the beginning about how do authoritarian systems exploit this, and how does their election meddling function? I think when it comes, for example, to Germany, but also to France, so functioning democracies with this kind of non-democratic minority, the strategy is basically to use this minority, to grow this minority so that it can prevent a functioning democracy. Because, for example, if you look at the case of Germany, the AfD at the moment at least doesn't really have the chance to become a ruling party on the federal level, and probably not even on the state level. So it doesn't really make sense to invest in these kind of parties in terms of them becoming the ruling party on the federal level. But what it does make sense is to grow this, or to help grow this party in the elections in a way that it can influence all the other parties. So what, for example, see on the federal on the state level in Germany is that we have quite grand coalitions, because a lot of parties have to cooperate to find a majority beyond the right-wing populists. And that, of course, is quite a problem for German democracy, because it creates the perception among the population that there's not really a difference between parties, that they don't really have a choice. And I think this is something how, especially Russia, but also other authoritarian regimes, exploit these kind of phenomena in Germany. But of course, as I said, this is quite different when it comes to other cases, especially if you look at Poland, where the populist governing party, PiS, is straight anti-Russian. So it's kind of like very different setups.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just before we turn the attention to another part of the world, let's just...
Could I say just a word about Europe?
Sure.
Yeah, you know, I want to just add two things. I think that there's really important things there. One to me is when I look at Europe and I look at the European Union, I feel like the enlargement and membership process and the way that it's governed reflect those dreams of 1989 in a certain sense. So while there was conditionality of meeting the so-called Copenhagen criteria of being a functioning democracy to join the EU, once you're in, there is no mechanism other than consensus, which is hard to imagine operating when you're a backslide, to discipline or challenge a backsliding democracy, or at least it's very difficult. The current mechanism around the COVID funds and the small questions have been, it took 3 years, it's been very hard to do so. And so the EU in some ways is missing instruments to figure out how to manage these issues. And I feel like that is one of the real issues. And that was based on the notion of consensus works if there is, you know, Sarah said no choice. I wanted to smile and say in the German context, no alternative. And so I think that this issue of the EU institutions and their ability to play the disciplining role that many aspired that they would play initially is actually a really important point to be understanding sort of those particular challenges that we've seen there.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I know that a lot of countries who would like to become member of the European Union are complaining a little bit all this, you know, requirements and bureaucracy sometimes, you know, that they see from their part.
But I definitely want to underscore her point that even if the party isn't the ruling party, that it can create incentives for others to compete for those votes. I think that her observation is really needs to guide our thinking about how we understand the potential influence, even if they're not going to win the majority of votes. They are going to drive the party's votes that are alongside that. And we've seen that in many countries in Europe where the center-right party has been moving further right because of the apparent electoral success of right-wing populist parties.
Yeah. Talking about votes, just, you know, before we turn the attention to another part of the world, I think, you know, here in the US, we just observed that voters rejected extreme restrict voting and overhaul the electoral process. And John, you explained, you know, that your sentiment about these midterm elections. But do you see any attempts in really using electoral processes to tweak certain outcomes in the United States, but also in Europe? Do we see leaders or parties sort of trying to finesse the electoral process sort of towards outcomes that are beneficial to them?
Sarah, would you want to go first this time?
So I think that's probably a yes for the US, but I would leave that up for Glenn. So what we see in Europe, I think, is not in, so at least so far not, try damages done to the electoral process itself. So when you think about like the electoral process in a narrow sense, so really like the process of voting, of counting, of calculating, we do have this risk, of course, especially when it comes to cyber attacks, but that's not something that I think is very typical for Europe. But please correct me if I'm wrong, because there are many European countries, probably a missing case here. But what I see more of a concern to Europe is the interference in the pre-process of elections. So not in this narrow sense, but rather in the pre-process when it comes about campaigning, who's running, what kind of topics are certain politicians or parties favoring in their election process. So, for example, when it, is it a question of, for example, of national sovereignty? So we, for example, coming back to the Russian case, we see certain topics popping up that are often emphasized and supported by Russian narratives, also by Russian news outlets, and these doesn't have to be necessarily topics that are closely connected or obviously connected to Russia, so for example, sanctions or or a conflict in Eastern Europe also before February this year, but rather topic when it comes, for example, to European sovereignty, especially from the US, when it comes to malfunctioning of democratic system, when it comes to, like the populistic sentiment of us versus the elites. And that's something what I see particularly happening all over Europe. But if I'm missing the case of, like really rigging the election process, please correct me.
I think that was really interesting. And another thing that came to my mind when I listened to you, talk about the pre-electoral process was financing, which is also a big topic in the US. And, I know in Germany there are strict regulations. John, I don't know, what about in the United States? Is it like the person with the most money wins, or is that oversimplified?
We've certainly seen the most expensive midterm elections in history.
Okay.
The other thing I would say about that, if I may, just to pick up on some of the things Sarah was saying there, that I think it's, while we haven't seen the kind of direct undermining of specific votes per se, I think in places like Hungary, I think it's incontestable that Orban has changed the election rules. They've sort of changed the rules by how many votes you win translates into how many seats in the parliament in ways that favor them and make them almost impossible to overcome. And this is one of those features that I think Sarah was describing earlier about the way they use existing structures and rules. And so, sure, everybody can vote, but the outcomes actually are not a simple representation of those votes. You asked about the United States, and I mean, January 6th was just that, was an attempt to do that. It was an attempt that I would call them one of the most difficult days in our country's history since the Civil War. I was relieved to see that it failed, but I think that we cannot underestimate just how significant that was. It's part of why I think there has been such attention to these sort of previously underobserved or under poorly understood institutions like state-level secretaries of state that are the ones who formally manage the process. Could they be persuaded to dismiss the electors that was the result of the votes and introduce alternate electors as they were described there? And in each case, well, the sobering part was how many attempts we saw to even discuss that. But I think that and the horror that we may feel from that has to be tempered by the fact that they did not succeed, and so it's a tough call. I'm still a bit surprised and sorry and hope only this will change in the next couple of months that Congress has not taken this step. They've all agreed upon that. They've identified a weakness. It might have been seen as ambiguous what the role of the vice president was in certifying the election. Let's write a rule clarifying that. It might have been seen as ambiguous whether or not the roles of the different states could have in terms of bringing forth their votes to the national level to be tabulated for the presidency. Let's clarify that. My understanding is that there is a fairly clear agreement out there, and it's been fascinating that it's taken them this long to do it. I only hope that in the next few months, we will see it happen.
Okay, thank you so much. And we have one viewer question now talking about democratic backsliding in Europe and the US. So the viewer is asking, is reducing women's rights a symptom of democratic backsliding? For example, cutting abortion rights in Poland and the United States. Historically, the viewer mentioned Mussolini. So I don't know if you want to briefly comment on that.
Well, I think anti-feminism and especially right-wing populism are closely linked. So if we look at the ideology, for example, of a lot of right-wing terrorist attacks, but also when we look at the ideology of right-wing populist parties, anti-feminism is constantly present because in the end, I think that's my take on it. Extreme right-wing ideology is about maintaining or erecting social hierarchies. And I think one of the social hierarchies that forms or influences our social lives, our societies the most is, of course, the gender hierarchy. So if we take a look at the fact that a lot of democratic backsliding cases are driven or accompanied or linked to right-wing populism or right-wing ideology. So, for example, again, Hungary, Poland, but you also can make these cases, of course, for countries that, at least in our definition, do not face democratic backsliding, but rather back transitioning. So, for example, when we look at Russia, that never has been a democracy, and at least not a full-fledged democracy, not even in the 90s. We see this as a factor, as part of the ideology, and also, and I think that maybe points back to the greater, to the bigger picture of authoritarian versus democratic states in the global realm. It's used as a distinction, from Western liberalism that supports gender equality, even though if we're not there, I don't want to say that, but it's something that is supported by Western liberalism. I think it's a attempt to distinct like this particular separate civilizational aspiration of, for example, Russia, but also other countries. So I think, yeah, there's a big link, and honestly, I would wish for this link, especially when it comes to right-wing populist movements, but also to right-wing terrorism, that it's a link that is more publicly explored and discussed, because it's something that is dripping into our societies when we talk about, abortion rights, for example.
I think, Sarah, I'm with Sarah. I think the state of the rights of women in society are one of the greatest predictors of where it stands in terms of democratic next steps. Full stop. I think if we wanted to, and that's not just, and I can acknowledge for me that there's room for differences of opinion about exactly sort of what that looks like. I don't think women have one perspective on this either, but I think that when we wanted to understand whether the Taliban would honor its commitments to, they said, not be like they were before, all we had to do was look to see what they were saying they're going to do with women to know what that future was going to be. And I think that, and I just simply reemphasize, Sarah's right, the authoritarians that are out there, what's interesting is that we know that they don't have that kind of global counter view that we used to have in the Cold War, like the Soviets contest of a vision of a society versus the Western liberal democratic society. I mean, what is Putin's goal? Even what is Xi's goal? I don't think they want other countries necessarily to be like them, the way that we used to think about it that way. Well, they absolutely don't feel that it is enough to say they simply want power. And so they craft these counter narratives. And as Sarah's saying, they're counter narratives against a decadent West, of which gender in many forms are among the most sort of immediate targets. The target of gender studies in Hungary can be initially baffling to you if you don't understand what. Why would a gender studies department be something that the prime minister would ever pay attention to? Because it's part and parcel of an argument about a defender of cultural values. This is, of course, extends as well to LGBTQ rights. I mean, it's stunning to when you sort of read more deeply. If you read Tim Snyder's book, oh goodness, it's the one about the end. It's not the end of history, of course, but such a powerful analysis
on tyranny.
Thank you. No, I'm actually thinking about his son. Tim's actually a friend of mine from graduate school. Sorry, Tim, if you see this. It's but it's where he points out this thing that I remember hearing someone once say, he made you understand an event you thought you knew differently. And it was an analysis of Ukraine that highlighted all of this anti-gay rhetoric in the Maidan revolution in 2014. And you think, well, what does that have to do with anything in a certain sense? And in fact, it's about understanding the way that they're crafting this kind of alternative vision there. So suddenly I'm like trying to find here, because I feel terrible because I'm such a fan of Tim's work. But I think that it's work that the road to unfreedom. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm not better prepared there. I recommended this highly, but it's a way that both women's rights, gendered rights, LGBTQ pieces are fashioned as this kind of counter narrative against the West, that even our authoritarians that don't appear to offer an alternative vision in a certain sense to society, the way that we might have understood in the Cold War, they still use to their advantage. And it leads to things that can be puzzling at first if you don't understand how they're seeking to do so.
So John and Sarah, yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add on that, if anybody listening in today is interested in this, in the link between gendered communication or gender studies and the current conflict in Ukraine, I can only recommend a recent paper of Lisa Gaufman, and I'm missing the title, but she basically analyzes the gendered Russian communication on its war against Ukraine, where it's basically about how they push a narrative of toxic masculinity towards the victim Ukraine, which is a very gendered approach. It's really good piece. I can only recommend.
So you've both kind of anticipated at least one of the directions that I wanted to take this conversation, and I'd like to stick with Russia and the former Soviet space for a little bit longer, because I think that there are a number of political leaders in that region who sort of look to Moscow and want to take a page from Vladimir Putin's playbook as they think about how they can maintain hold in their country. I mean, we certainly see it in Belarus, but Sarah, let's maybe start with you, since you're an expert on Russia, but also on information policy. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how Putin has been able to hold power, how he's been able to consolidate power, and what some of the elements are that other leaders in more autocratic states are looking for? I think John made a very important point that, people like Putin, people like Xi don't necessarily want to be copied, but some of what they're doing is being copied.
So I think they're and this is maybe not a full picture, because there are a lot of aspects what still makes the Russian political system so stable, up to date, and of course there are I think typical aspects that we also see in a lot of authoritarian regimes, and that is of course repression, and repression in Russia is massively increasing over the last years, and of course it's something that is an atomization of the society. So most authoritarian systems profit from their citizens being not really participating politically, and not really just distancing themselves from politics. And I think those are quite typical aspects. But then there's also something that is very typical Russian, or at least in this kind of variant, quite typical Russian. And this is the system that Putin and his cronies created over the last roughly 2 decades. And it's basically not only about getting and maintaining control over different societal or different societal systems, so politics, economy, media, civil society, but it's also about how the system is constructed. So it's basically an effective power system that co-opts people by corruption, so they can, so it's a sharing system for resources, but it's also a system that creates complicity. So, if everybody takes part in corruption, everybody is corrupt, and for that reason, he can be or she can be prosecuted. But it's also a question of mutual control. So just think about the dozens of security services that we do see in Russia, and they're all in place to not only compete with one another but also to control one another. And then there's also, and that's maybe the information aspect of it, the fact that information is not shared equally among across the system, and all these factors keep people in the system and in their place, and also prevent them from trying maybe to overthrow or change the system, because they're profiting from it, but they also they're also prisoners of the system. And that's something that has been extremely successful up to date. And I think Putin is the core arbiter of the system that guarantees for the system by his personal popularity ratings. And I think that is, and that is something that I think in the post-Soviet space, not only some leaders like Lukashenko are trying to copy, but I also think it's, the other way around. Russia is exporting this system to other countries. We saw these attempts in Ukraine. We also see them in Belarus, for example, because by exporting this system, especially the corruption, it's a very good way to influence these countries. And we should be aware that maybe not on the same scale, but with some of the same instruments, like corruption, for example, Russia is also trying to influence other European states, also within the EU, for example.
Can I pick up on the Putin question?
Yeah, please.
I feel like it's really important to kind of put this, we're at this incredibly important moment, that one of the consequences of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, I think, has been a reassessment of Putin, especially on the continent and especially in Germany and parts of the United States as well. But I think that the argument for the longest time had been that Putin may have repressed his people domestically, but that he was a rational actor. He was someone we could do business with. And I think that what's happened with the invasion of Ukraine is I kind of hope a reassessment of our understanding of authoritarian regimes, and an understanding that what happens there doesn't stay at home, as Sarah says. They actively seek to undermine regimes in other places. And I remember in early February the conversation about Russia and Ukraine as the United States, the Baltic states, Poland, the Eastern European states were warning that this was likely to happen. You may remember the assessment. People would say, I see no military goal, no military success for Putin in doing this. I just can't see why he would do it. There's no military objective.
Right.
And it's in retrospect, we look back and we say, that's correct, but that wasn't the motivation. It wasn't a military objective. In fact, it was an objective that when we look back and we look at 2008 in Georgia, and we look at 2014 in Ukraine, and we look at the seizure of Crimea, that now it seems so clear, that pattern, that we need to understand that these authoritarian regimes operate on a different logic. They are not just other countries with perhaps unfortunate treatments of their human rights at home. Same, I would say, to China, but they have objectives that are global, that actually threaten in many ways some interests that we have.
So John, I mean, picking up on this point of these are regimes that operate on a different logic. I'd be interested in getting sort of each of your takes on the following. When we think about the relationship between authoritarian regimes and democratic states, and Sarah, you in an interview recently, or in a paper, I can't remember which it was, said we need a new compass, if you will, to deal with authoritarian regimes. And whether it's a compass or whether it's a roadmap, in light of the developments that we've been talking about today and that we've been seeing, and that Freedom House has documented, what would this new tool, this compass, this roadmap look like for dealing with some of these autocratic countries? Sarah, maybe you go first, and then we can bring John back in.
So I guess I referred in saying this to the Russian case, and also the current discussion on China and Germany, because there has been, probably most of you are aware of it, there's changed true rapprochement, this Ostpolitik paradigm within German foreign policy, so that by cooperating and linking Germany and Russia would slowly start to become like Germany, so like more liberal, more democratic. This was by far not the approach that Germany favored to all authoritarian systems. So, for example, if you look to Egypt, it was something totally different. But there was something that really guided German foreign policy there was a lot of authoritarian regimes, most prominently Russia, but also partly China. And like most of the Russia community in Germany has been advocating for years that this paradigm should be dead, because it is dead. It's basically already killed, and we should acknowledge that. It didn't work out that well, and I hope we're at this point to acknowledge this at the moment. But I think even if we do so, the next challenge is arising on the horizon, is arising at the horizon, that is China, because we do not only have to kill this approach when it comes to Russia, but we also have to kill this approach when it comes to China.
Mm-hmm.
So I think and this is like really like a basic demand, but when we're designing this new kind of compass towards authoritarian regimes, we should make at first clear that there's, I think, a difference between like-minded democratic states and authoritarian states, and that we do need different approaches, and that we do need an approach that, if it works with links or with cooperation, may it be economically, politically, culturally, whatsoever, we have to be clear about the fact that this can also be a risk for ourselves, so that it's not only, you know, like a one-way street that works in in the direction towards the authoritarian regimes, but also the other way around. And so this can be a risk for us, and that's something that especially Germany has not been willing to acknowledge for years. And I think that would, for me, would be a very basic demand to start with. And I honestly thought it would be an obvious one now, after the second invasion of Russia into Ukraine in February. But when I observe the German discussion on China and what we can learn on the Chinese case from the Russian case, I actually doubt that we're there.
Can I jump in with this?
Yeah, please,
I
please,
really
John.
appreciate a lot of Sarah's comments there. I think I share many of her assessments, and yet I hear in my transatlantic conversations someone raising their hand and saying, but we can't isolate Russia, but we can't not trade with China. And I would like to suggest that we just sort of take those off the books, because that's not what anybody is advocating, even when they advocate a deeper and changed understanding of authoritarianism. I think that instead, the one word I might use is what we need is more strategic thinking about how we engage with them, and a recognition, exactly as Sarah said, about the way that it's not only our influence out, but ours in. So our economies are deeply intertwined with China's. We trade tremendously with China. Germany, of course, does as well. This is all true. But we recognize that in certain sectors right now that have to do in part with emerging technology, but also semiconductors in a certain sense, we're recognizing that there are unique risks to these sectors. Now, this doesn't mean we need to stop buying clothes from China or selling clothes to China, but that there are certain sectors that may have deeper security and national interest recognitions that we hadn't really integrated. We wanted to treat China and Russia as another normal country. Like you trade with Sweden, or you trade with Germany, or you trade with France. But in fact, these countries have different objectives. And I would also want us to remember that it is not merely, you don't have to believe me, listen to them. Putin sees his effort in Ukraine as a war against the West. It is not merely, this is a view of a civilizational war on his part and a defensive as such. China has goals to absolutely alter the global rules of the game that will make it sort of more possible for it to exert its influence. We can listen to them. Let's take them seriously when they say so, and recognize that we don't have to, it's not a matter of whether we should talk to them. Of course, we have security and nuclear concerns that we must talk to Russia about, as the two nuclear powers. We have economic relations with China that we cannot simply break and sort of, separate from. But more strategic thinking about where and how those pieces play out, be they strategic industries, be they a question of how we respond on these, how we allow their voices in international fora, where they seek to exert and change some of the international rules of the game. We need to be able to be more strategic. And I'm actually quite encouraged by Germany's move to develop its first national security strategy. And these documents are always, partial in a certain sense, but it's that move in that way to be thinking, I mean, the word can be overused, but I would say a more strategic assessment of how our interests are impacted in different ways and in different kinds of engagements.
So John, I'm happy that you brought up this point of strategic thinking when dealing with some of these countries. And as we come to a close here, I'd love to get each of your thoughts on sort of a different perspective, if you will. I think all of us on this call recognize that open societies are vulnerable. It's a strength at the same time as it's a weakness. It's sort of inherent in democracy. And as we think about some of these challenges, whether it be some of the internal challenges that we've talked about, or some of the external challenges that we've also talked about, the question that comes to my mind is how do we protect our democracies from these authoritarian influences and even from potential meddling? And so maybe that's not a fair question to ask with just a few minutes left, because we could spend a whole hour talking about that. But I'd really be interested in knowing from each of you how we can protect our democracies. What needs to be done to strengthen democracy at home?
I'm happy to start with a quick thought. So Sarah, why don't you?
Yeah, Sarah, why don't you go ahead and
I go ahead. So
Good.
So I would probably boil it down to 3 points, because I think there are many, but maybe like I just picked some of them, and they're like maybe like one external to internal ones, because as I said, I think it's about building resilience, and that's something that has to be produced and created domestically. But when it comes to the external perspective, and with regard to malign influence of authoritarian systems, I think it's about closing the gateway for malign influence. And of course, I'm well aware that this is not fully possible, because, you know, like you have like an open information space, and that's part of our open societies and liberal democracies. But nevertheless, there are certain gateways that can be closed better. First and foremost, corruption. I think this is something that is very important. For example, if we look at also at political decisions, for example, like Nord Stream 2, it's about securing our election process, not only like the core election process, but also like the pre-election process. I think this is very important. The second aspect, and that's already a domestic one, it's about simple political education. I think you're well aware that this is something that's very popular in Germany, but I think for a good reason, because you have to raise the awareness of people on this malign influence. People have, for example, to be capable of the distinction between, you know, like fake news and non-fake news, to start with a very basic thing. But also, and I think this leads already to the third point, it's about increasing trust in our political system. And this is done by, I think, political education, because, for example, if I talk to people who do not work in the foreign policy sphere or in the policy sphere at all, and I realize how they think politics or foreign policy in particular functions, it's often quite far away from how it really works. And I feel that this is something that we really have to take care of and to educate people how it works, because I think that is a good way to make them less disappointed, because they just know how it works. But it's also about, you know, working out on our political decisions, you know, when it comes to representation, to equality, to self-efficacy. I think these are all components that we have to work on. So yeah, summing up, focusing on domestic issues, but, you know, kind of like building a nice, but like a nice defense wall towards authoritarian regimes without really damaging our own open societies, because I think this is really like a balance act.
It's great points, and I'm with Sarah, absolutely. I would say she's given me the ability to go a little bit broader there because of the really insightful specifics that she suggested, media literacy, these kinds of issues here. You know, I would say that the first thing is that we need to constantly urge ourselves to go beyond what sometimes is called here in Washington, D.C., admiring the problem. You know, this has been an issue that we're aware of now. It's since 2016, and I would even say since 2014 with Russia's invasion of Crimea. We've become aware of these things. And I think that by and large, the US and Europe have done so, but we need to be recognizing and identifying what are the elements of an effective response. And I would merely observe that there's really two pieces of this. One is this issue of playing defense. How do we defend ourselves against authoritarian influences? How do we defend ourselves against domestic actors seeking to change the rules of the game? But ultimately, there's got to be an offense. There's got to be a democratic affirming role of this, an alternative vision that allows us to say, how do we define and advance a democratic agenda? And the only observation I'll leave you with is that every now and then, and not unnaturally, this conversation really focuses on the roles of governments. And I think governments are critical in many ways. They will set the terms for this landscape. But I would also really highlight the power and the roles of civil society, be they independent journalists highlighting and exposing the kinds of corruption that I think Sarah was talking about, be they groups that are mobilizing to defend democratic principles, be they associations that are actually sort of able to bring people together in an alternative vision for this. And I think it's understanding how this is really a whole of society approach. There's certainly government policy, but there's also very much about the role of our own societies in actually coming up with understanding how we respond, both to defend ourselves, but to advance a positive democratic agenda.
Thank you so much, John. And I love that you bring up civil society, because, of course, the American Council on Germany in 1014 were exactly those organizations and try to promote the dialogue on these issues. Which, interestingly, you're totally right. We focused on what governments should be doing or should not be doing. So that's actually an interesting take on that. So thank you both so much for joining us today for this super timely and I think also thought-provoking conversation. I think, we covered a lot of ground, this historic background, analyzed the tools, not just election meddling, but also this broad range of tools that authoritarian leaders tend to use to consolidate their power. Talked about the different approaches towards democracy versus authoritarian states in an interconnected world. So I know there were many, many more viewer questions that we weren't even able sort of to address, but I have a sense that this topic might stay with us for a little bit. So maybe we can continue that conversation in, another few months or so, see where we're at. So thank you very much for joining us. To our viewers, thank you for tuning in. And also thank you for your questions. Tomorrow, join the 1014 and ACG for a discussion about food insecurity and the war in Ukraine. And with that, thank you very much and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.